Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Legend of Tarzan. So, once we've gotten to far too many movies that are to be called Tarzan, I guess they had to switch it up and just say The Legend of Tarzan. And this movie, of course, be a live action variation where I think all the other Tarzan movies are to, of course, be mostly animated with the exclusion of the weird, goofy parody George of the Jungle, which I have to go on and mention with Brendan Fraser and whatever. Like they basically like, hey, it's not really Tarzan, but it's like it's everything of Tarzan with the exclusion of it actually being named Tarzan. Like we have the like the shouting, and we have the tree vine swinging thing, and so yeah, like it's every bit of Tarzan, with the exclusion of just a goofy comedic film. So, with that said, so we have it in this story where instead of having it to where Tarzan is to have a focused story where he's to meet all these characters for the first time, meet up with Jane, meet up with eventually there being some problem in the jungle that he's in, and he has to be the only one who is to solve it. We have little bits of flashbacks of how Tarzan becomes Tarzan and the early stages of Tarzan meeting Jane. We have those in flashbacks, but we mostly focus on the fact that Tarzan is to be reintegrated back into the world as John Clayton the Third, and that his family, John and Alice, were to have had like quite a fortune and quite an estate and everything like that, to have left John as they were to die on that island that they were on, or the Congo. And that isn't a massive surprise, because then how would you go on and do Tarzan? So a man raised by gorillas. So we go on into this story, and it's still done in like the 1890s, so it's like still not modern day Tarzan. We're still getting this this very much like old tale, which is still kind of cool. And so we have it on the opposite part of things. We also have the villain of this story, who is Leon Rom, who is to have King Leopold send Leon Rom to Congo, because King Leopold was to, in desperation, becoming bankrupt, and so he was to try to have someone go on into Congo to possibly find jewels or diamonds or treasures of sorts, because there is possibly somehow or another minerals within the Congo that is to possibly say that at some point there is a lot of blood diamonds and stuff there that they are just kind of not going on and digging out. So Leon Rom is to send a number of soldiers with him to go into the Congo, and we have Leon Rom, who is to meet up with Chief Mbonga, and it seems that Chief Mbonga is going to give this guy these diamonds, but in return, he wants something as well. He wants someone as well. So, and then title rolls, and then there's whole reasoning for why Chief Mbonga wants Tarzan so badly, because of flashbacks. And there's a whole reason why Tarzan would probably also want Chief Mbonga dead also. So, like, there's a whole reasoning within flashbacks and everything like that they go into this movie about. And so, yeah, like, there also is a lot of, like slow build to this movie, but to the point of us getting, like, really, like, swinging on vines Tarzan, and like we don't really get that to like the last real like 40 minutes of the movie, where he's like he's shouting out in the forest. And so like, yeah, we don't really get that until like 40 minutes in, but we get to see throughout most of this movie, Tarzan going on and beating people up, which is a pretty cool thing, and then going on and like we get to see like a certain kind of visuals that we wouldn't normally see in a number of other movies, just because like this kind of reminds me of the Billy Zane movie, The Phantom, and like stuff like that, where we go on and have these just kind of stories where it's like, oh yeah, it's Tarzan, of course, like yeah, like so we go on, and with that said, I'm just gonna go and say where exactly you can go on and see this movie for absolutely free. Because I think right now the only way that you can conveniently see this movie is to rent it or buy it or whichever. Probably more than likely, the price of which that you can rent or buy this movie, you can probably find it on Amazon for roughly that same price. And so you can probably buy a hard copy or just a copy of this movie for probably that price because it's been out for a while. But if not, then it is what it is. So, with that said, so you can go into some Google searches and be able to search the word "Let Her See Movies." So one of these and then movies app. Hopefully, you can there in fact find this app and be able to go on and download this thing so you can be able to see a number of different things, movies, stuff that you would normally have to go on exclusively on certain apps and certain monthly fees. You can also go on to another app called Fox HD Movies. You can go to search those words because there, in fact, you would have to go on and see a logo that says Fox HD Movies, but a title that says Play 1080p HD Movies. That's the whole title. But here's also the way of which that I just watched this before I went on here to review this movie. You can go on to a Google Play Store and search the word TV Crush, which is 2 words. So you can eventually find an app that in fact has a logo that says HD Movies, the crown off the side. Download that app and be able to see The Legend of Tarzan for absolutely free. There'll be some ads in between the film, but like it's free film. So with that said, let's go out of our way to say that it's about that time to go into The Legend of Tarzan, because I think it's just about that time to just say that it's time to go out of our way into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about the time to spoil this movie. So, like I was to go on and say before, King Leopold sending Leon Rom out into the Congo forest to look for these diamonds, making his way to a place that there is to be possibly these diamonds of Opar, and all of a sudden, while Leon Rom is with these soldiers, he, of course, is to see a spear go flying nearby him. Realizing that these tribal people are to go on and want to kill these people, these soldiers turn around and just start blasting the forest with all this, with all these guns that they have via this time period, which is 1890, and eventually leaving a number of these tribal people to be dead. So they go on further into trying to find exactly a possibility of where these diamonds are, and they end up finding them surrounded by more of these tribal men that are to have these spears to chuck upon these people, and now we start having these soldiers dropping like flies, like Captain Mowell, the guy who is to whip out his sword and be like, "Come on, men!" Ting, 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 and desperately trying to go on and defend Leon Rom, who is just having these shields over his head, hoping that he doesn't get killed off here because he's the villain of this story. So every one of this guy's soldiers, Leon Rom's soldiers, is to die, and so Leon Rom is to go on and notice that all these tribal men are circling around him. And so he, of course, is to get approached by a man. And so Leon Rom is to take this spider silk string that he is to have the this thing that is to look like this um, wooden crucifix on it, and is to have a number of like rosary like beads, and he is to take these beads and to use them as a device to go on and take this man down. And so at some point we'll see the spider string eventually being used at some point later on in the film, when eventually we have it where Leon Rom wants to get the advantage upon certain characters. So we have Leon that is to go and turn to Chief Mbonga and is to make an offer with him for these diamonds. And Mbonga's like, well, guess what I want? I want Tarzan. So title goes over the screen, and so now we have it, of course, where Tarzan is to make it to this meeting with the Prime Minister, and we, of course, are to meet George Washington Williams, who is Samuel Jackson's character. So we go on into this meeting, and John Clayton is to be persuaded to go back into the Congo, and John Clayton is to be Tarzan, and he is like, I have no interest in going back there. Like I've gone on to have this estate and have all these things. Like I don't want to go back. And George is to sit up and tell Tarzan, it's like, well, here's the thing. Here's the only reason why we're gonna go on and make this deal to you. Because you know what, like you're Tarzan, like you have this story about you, and these guys want to profit off of that. They want to figure out how to profit off of that. And so they want you to go back to Congo so like you in this story could actually start to make some money. And John is like, yeah, I have no interest in that. So John just leaves, but George is to follow John and go on and tell him another reasoning for why John should take the invitation of King Leopold's to go back to the Congo. And so George is mentioning that there is some unsavory things going on in Congo, that there might be some slavery or might be something that George desperately needs to go on and investigate because he wants to figure out why they're doing what they're doing, and he needs Tarzan's help because he's familiar with that area. And John is like, okay, like I'll go to the Congo, we'll see what happens. Fine. So Tarzan is to go on, and I probably should call him John, but I'm just going to keep calling him Tarzan. It's easier. And even though it's a longer name than John, but still. So Tarzan is to make his way back to where Jane is teaching a bunch of kids a number of animal facts. So Tarzan is to make his way into this place, and Jane is to ask the people, like, can you make the sound of the bird that I enjoy? And Tarzan is to go on and make that sound, and then Jane is to let her kids loose to see that Tarzan is there, and so they start asking him questions, like simply about like, well, hey, like why is it that your hands are much different than everyone else's? And Tarzan is to go on and say that he had spent a number of years just kind of walking on all fours, and so eventually his hands needed to adjust to eventually kind of taking on that kind of demand. And so they eventually also ask him if Tarzan's mother was a gorilla, and John is to go on and say no, like my mother was Alice. So, and she of course is dead. So after all these questions, Tarzan is to go on and meet with Jane, and is to tell her that he is to go on to Congo. And Jane's like, well, I'm going with you. Like, I'm going to bring a number of corsets, and like, we're just going to go. And Tarzan's like, no, like, I can't risk your safety. Like, you're not going to Congo. And Tarzan is telling Jane that her home is here. And Jane's like, our home was never here. Like, our home was out there, like in Congo, like where we've spent so much time together. So eventually we have it where Tarzan and Jane are talking about the kid that they lost during birth. And so Tarzan is to finally go onto this tree, grabbing with one arm to go onto this tree, and is to convince Jane, like, okay, if you go on and you come with me and you go to a place where you're protected the whole time, like, I'll go on and have you here. And Jane's like, okay, great. And so they hug and embrace and whatever. So we go on, and we also have Liam Rom, who is to be talking to Mr. Frum, and eventually Frum is, of course, to want this payment, and like, how much longer is this going to take? And Leon Rom is to say that it's going to take a number of days. Leon Rom is to try to figure out shortcuts so that way he can make his way back to where Tarzan is eventually going to be, and try to retrieve him. But one way or the other, they're going to go on and have Tarzan make his way back to Congo so Mbanga can take him out. So we go on, and we of course have George, John, and Jane going together on this trip. And so really just John being the guide here. So we have the three of them going to make their way to this place of this Kuba tribe. And so while they're going to go on and have Jane reminisce about the home that she used to live in with her father, we have them go and meet the Kuba chief and all the people that they, of course, are to all know. And so they have this fire. They have it to where George is to be handed this beer, and he's like, this thing is foaming, but I don't trust what's in it. And so Jane is telling the tribal people, it's like, hey, he's afraid of beer. And so he drinks it, and he's like, oh, okay, all right, like, you've got me. Like, So all the people are going on and singing this song, and George is asking Jane, like, what are they singing about? And Jane is to mention that they're singing about Tarzan, because Tarzan, I guess, is to have his own greatest hits of songs. So after Jane is to make her way back to her place, we all of a sudden have Jane who's like talking to Tarzan, and Tarzan is to make all these mating calls from all these animals, and Jane is to rattle off every one that they are. And so Tarzan is to make his way to Jane and sleep with her, which we don't see anything of that of. So all of a sudden, we then have Leon Rom and his soldier men make their way to, of course, where Tarzan is. And so Leon Rom is to make it to this Kuba chief, who they're telling him to kneel, and like, the Kuba chief doesn't kneel, so he ends up getting killed. And then a number of these Kuba guys, like X number of the strongest, are to be taken, so that way they can just easily become eventual slaves. So we have, of course, where Tarzan is to be aware of what's going on, and so he starts grabbing men that are coming nearby his house and taking them out, and then is to go on and trying to rescue the Kuba people, and eventually is to get into a snag where all of a sudden he is to get roped up and then is to get netted, and then is to be dragged on to this boat where eventually George is to have to go on and save Tarzan by shooting a number of the men that are to all trying to be dragging Tarzan away, as they're kind of making fun of Tarzan, they're making monkey sounds and all of this stuff. So, as we have it where George is to start firing these guns and is to nail a bunch of the guys who are holding the net of Tarzan, we have it to where Tarzan is to be cut free by George. But then we turn around and we have Leon Rom, who is to have Jane in this boat. And so Leon Rom is telling Jane that she should scream so that way Tarzan knows that Jane is on this boat. But eventually, I'm sure Tarzan will figure it out anyways. So, flashbacks. Let's go on to some flashbacks. So, we go on into this story and we have to set up that, of course, Tarzan was to have a father on the Congo Island that was stuck there with his wife and then his baby Tarzan. And so, come to find out, Alice eventually is to become ill and then is to die. And John is to leave his son this letter, hoping that at some point, someday, he'll be able to read it. And like kind of have this like last will and testament of like, hey, like I'm gonna have to probably give all of this to you because I'm going to be dead, probably because there's no guarantee that this guy will be able to survive in this kind of jungle. And naturally, assuming that a baby would, there's some flimsy things going on here. But so we have it, of course, where John is to make his way through this forest, and he is to be met by a gorilla who I'm assuming is Kerchak, who is to beat him to death. And so we have Kala, who becomes Tarzan's surrogate gorilla mother, is to go into this treehouse and is to take Tarzan and then is to collect him. So we eventually have it at one point where Tarzan is to eventually make a mistake where Kumchaka is to kind of beat him down, and Kala is to give Tarzan some rock, of which Tarzan is to still hold on to. And come to find out, we have Tarzan, who is to technically have a gorilla brother, who is a coot. And eventually, at some point, Tarzan is to have to go on and confront a coot, because he is the leader of the gorillas. And Tarzan wants to re-win these guys over because technically, since he's been gone for so long, he is to be basically a deserter to the gorillas. We also have at some points where like George and Jane and Leon Rom are to eventually have to like kneel down in front of these gorillas and to kind of show them their hands and stuff like that, to like hope that these gorillas won't hurt them. Because like these people aren't used to being around gorillas, but Tarzan is, and so Tarzan is to go on and like possibly know how to fight them, but he's very rusty, and so eventually he'll get his clock cleaned because he's just rusty. Rusty being the man of the jungle. So with that said, we go on and we have John, who's wanting to go with some Kumba tribesmen to go after Jane. And George is like, well, hey, I'll go with you. And John's like, I think you're just going to slow us down. And John's like, no, like, hey, man, I can. And I'm like, oh my god, like there's gonna be so much running going on in here. And all these guys are to just go on and they're like running for days in this movie, and I'm like, oh my god, could you just imagine like the cardio of this film? And like I always go on and see like for how long, like we just have so many scenes where like people are probably just running all day long, and this is probably like who knows how many hours that like, well, hey, like this take wasn't good enough, like you look too winded in this take, so we got to try and do this again, and um and look less winded this time that you're running. It's like you like I've been running for the last 2 hours, and like this is ridiculous. So because we have all these takes where all like we have all these scenes where like they're running throughout the whole entire film, and I'm like, oh my god, like could you just imagine for just months on end just having to run through an entire film, and like this thing takes like months to do, and I like hopefully they can just do everything in one freaking take, or otherwise, hey, here's another hour that you're gonna have to run. It's just to redo. Like man, I would love like the breakdown of a certain film where like someone is like running like through most of the film, like how exactly like all of that is to just be like rationally broken down, because a lot of times like I would question, it's like man, like I'm sure this person had to like run everywhere within like a week's time, and I'm like freaking marathon running, I'm sure. Anyways, pushing on. I spent too much time on that, I apologize, but anyways, it's interesting to see the breakdown. So we go on and we have John and we have George in the Kuba people, who are to eventually make their way to have John meet up with Akut and try to win him over, and eventually he does, even though he gets bitten by his brother, and that bite ends up getting a possible infection, and then George is to put these bugs on it, and John is to take one of these bugs and eat it, and George is like, did you seriously just eat that bug? And John's like, yeah, it just tastes like bacon. It's like, who cares? And so George's like, oh, all right, like, but I ain't gonna eat no bug. So we go on, and so John and George make their way with the Kuba tribe to vine their way and are to fall their way because gravity onto these trees, and just kind of run their way through all these trees because they want to chase down this train. This train that is supposedly have a number of slaves, but have a number of soldiers there also. So they chase down this train and they make it to this train. They pull like a Captain America: The First Avenger thing where they have those like zip lines, but instead they have these like weird long stretch of vines that are to make it onto this train. And so, and they knock all these guys down. So we have it where George had jumped onto John's back because the vine that George was supposed to swing on, like the vine didn't really hold at all. So John is just telling George, just jump on my back and we'll swing. And so George is like, well, hey, like don't like think that like you're saving me or anything. Like we had the one moment where Tarzan was telling George to eventually just bow down to him, or to bow down in front of a coot, and so George is saying like, well, like should I go on and like and lick his sack to hopefully win him over? And Tarzan is like, well, are you gonna? And he's like, of course not. And he's like, I think you are going to. So we replay that joke somewhere later in the film, like towards the end, where George is to ask Tarzan, it's like, well, hey, like, are you, like, you're gonna hug me? And Tarzan's like, well, I didn't think about it. And George is like, yeah, you were. And they replay that joke of like, like, it's a fun ending. So we have it where they make it on this train and they find all these slaves and documents to see what they're all doing. And so they make it into one of these train compartments, and they find there's a bunch of soldiers there, and Tarzan is just starting to beat them up. And like George is getting his licks in, but like we go on and have these guys that are just getting decked by Tarzan. So come to find out, the reasoning why these soldiers are going on and doing this is because we come to find out that these guys want to figure out a way to enslave like all of Africa. They want to figure out a way to go on and like take control of everything and basically make everyone under the control of them via this place so they can go on and make them all workers. So we have George with these documents, and he gives them to the Kuba people and saying like, well, hey, if we're not back by X number of days, send these documents to London and they'll figure out what to do. Like, just kind of give them, hopefully, to the Prime Minister, and they'll figure it out. So we have John and George that are, and it's kind of funny when you really think about it, because George of the Jungle and George Washington Williams. Anyways, so John and George continue to make their way to hopefully rescue Jane from off of this boat. So Leon Rom and Jane, we have it at points where Leon Rom is talking to Jane and like asking her, it's like, oh, we're all like, is that person specifically a friend of yours? And Jane is like saying like, no, all the Kuba people, they're all friends of mine. And so Leon Rom is like, like, I think I can do something with that. And so Leon Rom is to have Jane in this room of this boat, and they are to have dinner together. And if Jane does anything to have eventually tried to kill Leon, one of the Kuba people is in this cage and he'll get drowned if they find out that Leon Rom is dead. So, but Jane is to try to like take this knife, or is to try to grab the spider silk string away from Leon Rom, and Leon Rom comes up with a way to grab Jane's hand with the spider string silk, and is to just kind of like tug her away, just like, aha, like, I caught you. So Leon Rom and Jane are talking, and eventually this just all leads to Jane eventually leaving, and at some point we go on and we have one of these Kuba people who ended up getting drowned anyways, and that's what Jane goes on and dives after him, and is to have both Jane and one of the Kuba guys run off together. And so they're like, well, hey, like, it doesn't matter, like, Tarzan is gonna think that we have Jane, and that's all that really matters. So either way, like, Tarzan's gonna want to go on and get his revenge, and so we're gonna have Jane regardless. So now we go on, and at some point in this movie we find out exactly why Mbanga is to want to have Tarzan dead. Come to find out, Chief Mbanga is to lose his only son. And the reason why that is that Tarzan was to one day come back to find Kala, who is his gorilla mother, was to be killed by Mbanga's son. And so Tarzan turned around and found where this guy was and killed them all off. And so Mbanga is to be upset with that. And so, like, Tarzan had just decided to flee the Congo so that way he will never go on and continue to be under the threat of Mbanga. Like, when is he going to come? Like, when is he going to get me? When is he going to kill me? Because that's eventually going to happen. So, now that that whole story is played out, so we eventually have it where Jane and the Kuba tribesmen are to eventually go on and to meet up with the gorillas. And so we have it where Jane is to go on and bow to them. And we have it where Leon Rom is to see exactly where Jane is and is to scoop her back up and take her away slowly but surely, as Leon is also bowing and showing his hands also. And so eventually they re-obtain Jane to eventually having Tarzan still making his way eventually to go and have to fight out Mbanga either way. Because eventually Mbanga is to know that Tarzan's in town, so to speak, so eventually they have to have it out. So Chief Mbanga is to want to take Tarzan out by himself. He's not going to have his lackeys do it. He personally is going to see to this guy's death. So when Tarzan is to make his way to Mbanga and they have this fight out, Mbanga is to have these kind of cool, like, little kind of claws that he has to try to attack Tarzan. And so we go on and we have Tarzan who dukes it out with Mbanga, and eventually how this all plays out is eventually Tarzan is to get this like end of a spear, and he breaks it off and is to want to have this spear piece to Mbanga's throat. And so Mbanga is to mention, like, well, hey, like, why did you kill my son? Like, do you have no honor? And Tarzan is like, no, like, by that time I had none. Like I didn't even, like, he probably didn't even know what honor really was or what it meant. So Mbanga, I guess, after seeing Tarzan there, and is to get over the grief of his son, and Tarzan is to convince Mbanga that there is a bigger threat here than him or Tarzan, and so they gotta put aside their petty difference, because of course Elong Rong is to want to go on and be at the port of Bama, and is to have, like, a number of soldiers all there with a number of these big artillery guns, and is to eventually go through Congo and basically wipe it out, whatever threat is really left. So that's the real threat that they should, like, combine together to go up against this threat. But what we really have us do here is Tarzan is just making his way with all these animals to go on and just, like, bulldoze over like all of these army men, all of these military men, and having people all run around to try and run away from all these bulls and uh, all these elephants and all these animals of sorts. They're just rampaging their way through all this place, trying to get to everybody and take them all down. And so we have Tarzan just easily making his way through all of these, uh, like jumping onto certain animals and trying to go on and make it through this rampage of all these animals, jumping from animal to animal, making his way to this pier, this bridge, to eventually try to take down some of these soldiers as well. He's getting hit with bullets a couple of times. So we also have George, who is to see this substantial gun that he's like, oh my god, like this is gonna be way better than the guns that I had before. And so he's just pelting this boat with bullets, still trying to have Tarzan make his way to this boat to try to rescue Jane. And we have it where Leon is supposed to hand off to Mr. Frum these diamonds for this payout, and come to find out that this boat is to be riddled with bullets, and Tarzan is to go through it and do all that he is to do to then have this boat start to sink. And so Mr. Frum is just kind of waiting for this handout, and while this boat is sinking, he is to not be able to, fortunately, be able to get this payout. And so Mr. Frum, eventually at the end of all this, is like, dude, so we did all of this stuff for absolutely free. Like, all the stuff that we did for Leon, we had to do it for absolutely free. Because eventually, at some point, everyone will get killed off here. Because at some point, Tarzan is going to go on and send all these alligators into this boat, and is to eventually go after Leon Rom, and is to save Jane, and is to just go on and finish this up here. So we have Tarzan that makes it onto this boat and is to have this fight out with Leon Rom, because that's the big focus. And so Leon Rom is to have his spider silk string to then latch Tarzan to where he's choking upon this this one part of this boat. And Leon Rom is thinking that like Tarzan is going to die and get choked out here, and Tarzan is setting up a mating call for these alligators to call them over here, and then Tarzan is to kick Leon Rom away for him to go on and be served up by these gators, as Tarzan is to break this silver silk string, and then is to go on and see that Leon Rom is to be killed. And so then Tarzan is to go on and like be the hero of the day, that all these slaves are now free and Congo is then free again. And we also had the moment where Tarzan was to meet up with these I think they're like mountain lion, like cubs, or like he's known them since they were cubs, and so like he just goes on and just he touches them, and like it's familiar territory, as if they know Tarzan before. And Jane's like, well, like he's known them since they were cubs, and so like they're very familiar with one another. It's like, oh, okay. So we have it at the end of this where Tarzan is just to stay in Congo and is at some point going to go on and have Jane deliver this baby. And we now have it where Tarzan is to have this child. And so all is to be well at the end of this film, as we have it to where George is to go back to the Prime Minister and is to eventually have this letter being wrote to basically say that any of like King Leopold and all these guys are going to be put up on charges for all the horrible things that they did, and so on and so forth. And that's just the way the movie just kind of finishes up. So with that said, I think I'm going to finish up to try to get out here so I can go on and possibly sneak uh, one more movie in here before the day is up. So goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.